Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Foxpunter Manager Profiling. Once again, we'll be delving into the world of leadership and using the myers-briggs model, we'll be putting the spotlight on two of the game's most recognisable figureheads. If you enjoy what you hear over the next 40 minutes, please do like and subscribe this podcast. And if you can spare any time over the next few weeks as well, we'd love you to go back and listen to our previous episodes, which include the likes of Neil Harris, Chris Hughton and Pep Guardiola. The latter may be particularly relevant after listening to this week's episode. More on that later on. My name is Jack Critchley, but the man with all of the wise words is Foxpunter's Mike Holden. Mike, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Jack. How about yourself?
Yeah, not bad at all. Not bad at all. The games are coming thick and fast now, so loads of stuff to delve into and loads to watch sort of every single day at the moment, which is terrific. And lots going on the pitch, but this week, Mike, not a huge amount off it. Very little management movement to muse over. We do have, though, one change in League One, and it's Sam Ricketts out and Steve Cotterill in at Shrewsbury. What do you make of this swap?
Yeah, I think Sam Ricketts can have no complaints whatsoever. I think he's had long enough to... I think his main problem was that he bedded in one identity last season, which was quite negative, quite cautious, but effective when it worked. You know, you could see what he was trying to do. And then in trying to add a bit more creativity this season, he's kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because he lost all sense of what the identity was last season and just how difficult Shrewsbury were to break down. They were suddenly taking the game to opponents and being picked off quite easily and lots of individual errors. And, you know, to hear him speak was as if they were absolutely dominating every week. I'm not sure the football was that great, but he's kind of gone, you know, there should have been a continuation of what he was doing, or at least building on the work he'd done. But to shift from one identity to another, I just, you know, you could see it was kind of became inevitable in the end that he would go.
And Steve Cotterill, a man who has vast experience across all three of the EFL divisions, but out of the game for 3 years and does have the tendency to occasionally rub people up the wrong way. It could either all go right or it could either all go wrong. There seems to be no room for in between with Cotterill.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character, and I'm really looking forward to profiling him, because since I started profiling, like in the way that I do now with Myers-Briggs, I don't know anything about Cotterill really. I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence about him. I remember lots of things in his previous jobs about him. But now applying type to it, it's going to be really interesting, because I'm not entirely sure what to expect. I've got all my suspicions and different things like that. But yeah, he is a funny character, because, like you say, you never really know what you're going to get with him on any given day in a media conference, or his players, whether he's going to gel with his players or not. I think my first concern for him is that most of his best success has been, you know, he's possibly one of these managers. We talk about the generations and how dressing rooms have changed. He's another one where you're thinking, right, okay, you had all this success previously, but how are you fitting with this generation now? You know, is it still applicable? Does it still work?
Yeah, and 3 years is a long time to be out of the game as well, so it remains to be seen how he acclimatises to life back in League One. And Shrewsbury under Sam Ricketts, as you mentioned, evolving that style, but having a terrible home record against all of the sides around them in the table. They've not played any real top half sides at home this season, and I think they failed to win any of those games. So it's interesting to see whether Steve Cotterill can pep those Shrewsbury players up in the coming weeks. We'll keep our eye on that. And of course, Mike, once you've got all your notes together, I'm sure we'll do a full episode on Steve Cotterill, and I'm sure we could probably get maybe at least 60 minutes out of that. Fascinating character, as you say. And talking of fascinating characters, that moves us nicely into today's main subject, who is Marcelo Bielsa. Vastly experienced, of course. First time in the English game, though, with Leeds United. Got them up, ended a 16-year wait from the Championship to the Premier League. And he has been nominated as one of the most influential coaches in the world. A few people, Mike, before we sort of delve into it, what he does, a few people unhappy with this decision, because he's sat alongside Champions League winners and top flight league winners as well. And yeah, he's got Leeds up, but he's done something that many other managers couldn't.
Yeah, it's a fantastic achievement what he's done at Leeds United, working with so many young players. I can understand the well, outrage is a strong word. I wouldn't be outraged by it myself, but I can understand why people are questioning that he's got this FIFA nomination. Because, there's plenty of other managers that have achieved just as much. But I think he's become this iconic figure, basically, because he's been around the block for so long. And these are potentially his glory days now. Obviously, international football with Chile. But to be in the Premier League at this time of his life and evolving his style in a way that, so many managers, the game's left them behind of his age. And he's there still innovating at this age, 65 years old now, and he's still one of the game's biggest innovators as it is today.
Yeah, and like you say, you do sense that other managers who have either become out of touch with certainly the younger generation of players tend to kind of go upstairs, so to speak, to use a cliche, or take another role on at a club. But Bielsa very much at the forefront of what is going on at Leeds, and it's hard to ever see his appetite for and his thirst for coaching dying down, isn't it?
He's absolutely in his element, I think, at the moment. We're talking about a manager that back in the 1990s was famed for his extensive library of videos of football matches. Hundreds and hundreds of videos. Long before video analysis became a thing, he was the ultimate, video analyzer. So now to have all these resources that are just at his fingertips, and to have a backroom team of sports scientists and analytics people, and who can read into the statistics, not just what you're seeing on the television, on the video footage. To have all of these resources available to him must be a dream come true, because this is only recent developments in his career, and it is all perfectly suited to his personality type and his love of systems thinking and pattern recognition of tactical styles and game plans and all of these kind of things. It's a flow state for him. It's what he absolutely thrives on. And like I say, he's just in his element. I think this is the time and the place that Marcelo Bielsa was always going to enjoy his football management most.
Yeah, what else then do we know about Marcelo Bielsa's personality type? Of course, he gets plenty of column inches in the newspapers, and there's been plenty written about him over the last few years, and we'll touch on one or two of the bigger stories. I think you can probably imagine which one we might be mentioning. But what else do we know about his personality type, apart from being incredibly meticulous and detailed?
Yeah, well, there was an interesting piece last week by Michael Cox on The Athletic, talking about basically that, Bielsa's got this reputation as being one of the game's biggest influencers, as in most of today's managers have been influenced by Bielsa, but yet his style is still so unique. So how can that be a case? It seems to be a contradiction. And I think he's right. I think he is more unique than he is an influencer. I just think that he basically, in a time period when pressing football wasn't all the rage, we're talking about the early Mourinho years and that kind of time, Bielsa was still championing pressing football. He was still, what is now commonplace in the game. He was doing it long before everyone else. So kind of think anybody who came into contact with him as a player, your likes of Maurizio Pochettino and Diego Simeone and players like that. And even, the famous story about Pep Guardiola going to visit him in Argentina and spending time with him. I think any managers, later managers who've come into contact with Bielsa, have understood their concepts of the early concepts of pressing through his interpretation, because he's been doing it for so long when others weren't. But it's about his uniqueness and his ability to keep evolving, I think, is what separates him. I think too much is made of the influencer thing, but his uniqueness is his ability to understand systems on a ridiculous level, of being able to see how literally everything on a football pitch interconnects. That if you make one tweak at right back, how it affects what happens on the left wing. All areas of the pitch. He's got this incredible ability to understand and work out what's going to happen next. If you make one change in this specific area of the pitch, how is it going to affect everything everywhere else? And because he's got such a thirst for this and enjoys it so much, this is what enables him to keep evolving and changing the way he plays. Because I don't think there's been one consistent Bielsa style. you know, and I don't know all the tactical nuance myself. It's not a strength of mine to understand all of that. But I do know that he thrives on anything novel and new. So I don't think he ever stops evolving the way he plays. And he likes to be different. And I think, you know, Michael Cox talks in that piece about how Leeds are the only team that literally press man-for-man marking all over the pitch. And that speaks perfectly to his personality, because he wants to be the only one to do something if he can. And it doesn't mean sticking to one. He's got this reputation of having this one philosophy, as if he's always had the same philosophy and he keeps pushing the same philosophy. But no, he'll keep changing. He'll keep changing, wanting to be different and wanting to surprise people. Because for him, the actual buzz is the feedback of seeing how new things emerge and how the new things connect differently to how the old things used to connect.
So is that why he differs to last week's subject, Pep Guardiola, then? Because often they get lumped in together. You know, we saw a big thing was made of the match when Man City and Leeds drew 1-1 earlier in the season about, you know, master and apprentice. And we know that Pep went to visit Marcelo in Argentina on his ranch, as Michael Cox mentions in the article. But they appear to be quite different in that you mentioned there that Marcelo Bielsa continues to evolve and he tweaks his system, whether that's a big change or just one or two movements that have altered. Whereas you talked last week about how Pep is very much married to his system, but maybe now a few opponents are starting to become wise to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the key difference, is that Pep is wedded to one system. And it's how can he evolve the same system? You know, it's not to say that there won't be changes within that system. And when I say system, I kind of mean philosophy. You know, it's the philosophy of way of playing, because when in personality terms you talk about systems thinking, it can be an entirely different thing to like in the tactical football sense. But for Guardiola, the main thing that links them both and why they're both the same is they're both process men and they don't really care about results. That is the one thing that unites them. Is first and foremost, it's about the performance. It's about the process. It's about trying to get this perfect process going and believing that results will take care of themselves. In that sense, they're very, very much the same. They're both about pattern recognition, but with Guardiola, it's about pattern recognition in his own internal world. It's like, I've got this thing in my head that I want to put onto the pitch, and I want it to be the same every week, and I want it to impose it on everyone else so they just suffocate everybody so they can't breathe with it. Whereas Bielsa, he loves chaos. He loves everything that goes on the pitch, and being able to instantly identify from, you know, observation, I suppose, of what's going to come next. If I do this, this is how it will change it. And he's very comfortable of making logical, rational decisions in the moment amid total chaos. I think the more chaotic a game is, the more it suits Bielsa if it comes down to a decision that he has to make as opposed to the opposition manager. I think most managers in the world have a much lower threshold for chaos on the pitch and being able to make sense of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing as well that Bielsa is sort of quite good at is improving players. And that may come down to system, because last week you talked about how Pep obviously gets his pick of the players, really. He kind of plays fantasy football in a way and is allowed to choose players and fit them into his system. But Bielsa, I mean, he's had to be obviously a little more savvy with the recruitment. But the players who've come into Leeds do seem quite well suited to the system. And there are players as well who previously had maybe been, I don't want to say nomadic, but certainly at a point in their career where something needed to happen. And undoubtedly, Bielsa has improved them. So he tends to work well with these players. Is there a certain type of personality that you need to be to thrive under Bielsa, do you think?
I think it helps that, you know, it kind of feeds back into this being the perfect time and place for Bielsa, in that he's working with youngsters. And I think people of his personality type you know, love potential, love to bring out potential, you know, see potential, because they can kind of see what's coming down the line, you know, if in terms of what that player is capable of, how they fit into a system and a pattern and a way of thinking and a way of playing the game. And then knowing what will emerge from that player, the talents that other people haven't seen. Well, here's how they can be showcased within this system. And like the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and older players might not be as receptive to new ideas and fresh ideas. Well, Bielsa now's at a time in his career where his reputation goes before him. He's kind of like this darling of the hipsters, I suppose, and young footballers who have no idea about Marcelo Bielsa's early career all know who he is, or he gets immediate respect for who he is and what he's done, and the fact that he's been a trailblazer, I suppose. So he's got that buy-in. I think young talented players buying in to what he wants is just ideal for him, and I think that's what's happened at Leeds, and that's what's materialised. And as long as there's that collective buy-in, individual buy-in, as long as the players are buying into what he's asking of them, and they have got that sort of talent, innate ability, technically, then there's nothing to stop them. And I just think it's the time and place for Bielsa, and the way that the recruitment's gone. Just it goes hand in glove with what he's trying to teach and how receptive the players are. And
he is, I think, quite strict, isn't he, with it as well? Because I can't credit who this is on Twitter, because I apologize, I read it about 3 or 4 weeks ago and I can't remember who tweeted it, but someone mentioned that he gets the players individually into his office, and he'll play footage of the last match back, and he'll make the players with a laser follow themselves around the pitch, so he knows that they're paying attention. And that delighted me to hear that and imagine that scenario, because it just sort of shows that there's absolutely no time or room for slacking when you're working under Bielsa.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard that before. That's fantastic. Just really fascinating. That's it. I think it's about getting ideas into players' heads. It's about passing on the information. He's not a manager that we've talked about. Certain managers who logically almost manhandle players on the training ground. You stand here. This is what you do. That's not Bielsa. Bielsa's about passing on, feeding information. He needs to know that information's going into players' brains. So that's obviously a technique he's developed, that he's learned down the years of, what concentration looks like and how to get concentration out of a player, so that the information's actually going in. But that's what he's about. It's about players to a certain extent being able to solve their own problems or know what's expected of them in any given moment without looking around for instruction and knowing, having to take feedback off somebody else in order to be in the right place at the right time. He needs to be sure that the players understand exactly what I'm asking of them and that the information's going in. So I guess that is a key strategy for him in order to do that. In terms of strictness, I'm not really sure. I just know he's a very obsessive character, and his own personal ability to retain information is very high. He can store so much information in his mind and call upon it at random access almost at will, and possibly understands that other players can't, so it needs to be drilled into them. So he's probably very intense in that sense.
Yeah, because I think he was one of the first reported managers during the lockdown in the UK, when, of course, we had no football for 3 months, that was apparently on the phone to his players, telling them, right, this is what you're doing, this is your fitness regime for the next few weeks. So he absolutely, he doesn't relax, does he? He doesn't take time to switch off.
No, there's no amount of information is too much, as well, we'll get onto Spygate, but it's literally, there's no limit to how much information he can take on board. We use the phrase "no stone left unturned," but it literally is, like you say, this is his flow state, and he loves feedback, as much feedback as possible, as much information as possible. The more I get, the better, the more I've got to work with, because I can retain it all in my mind and I can make use of it at some point. I don't know when, but if I'm going to be spontaneous within the context of a match and make a decision that's going to change a game, then I need to pile as much as I can in there and retain it all and organise it all and be able to make instant sense of it all.
Well, you've teed us up nicely there. Let's move on to Spygate, which feels like a long time ago now, doesn't it? When this broke and it was all over the news. And this is, I guess, kind of Bielsa in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, like I say, it goes to feedback and this thirst for information. And I think what that tends to do when this is your flow state, and you want to know things that other people don't know, and you want to be such an original thinker, you reach a point where you've exhausted all the avenues of information, all the normal avenues of getting on board information and processing things, that you have to go looking in new places and doing things in different ways. And that often means breaking rules. It often means, just pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable or not in order to take on board more information. In his head, that wouldn't have been cheating at all. It was just, I want more. I can't get enough information. I want more. I want more. I want more. He kind of reached a point where he was all exhausting so many different routes of information that, well, the only thing that's left for me to do is go to send someone to the opposition training ground and see what they're actually doing, and see if anything comes up that way that's new and original, because it's just this thirst for novelty, thirst for something new that has not been seen before, and then interpreting it into something that other people haven't seen before, and being that original innovator. Kind of, I guess in some ways you can make the comparison. It's like a nutty professor type thing going on, these crazy inventors. That's kind of the way his mind works.
So I often ask you who you can compare the managers in focus to, but given that we've talked about him being, an innovator, an original thinker as well, I guess there's not too many, because as Michael Cox points out in the Athletic piece, and if you haven't had a chance to go and read that, it is a fascinating 5 minutes read, and really insightful into the world of Marcelo Bielsa. But I guess if Diego Simeone and Mauricio Pochettino are still quite different to him, I guess he's not really comparable, is he, to anyone else?
There are a few characters, personalities. I wouldn't say his understanding of football is comparable to anyone else. We're seeing an extreme personality with an extreme ideology coming together. So you've got a very, very unique character. But there's other managers. Roy Hodgson's an example. I think is the same personality type as Marcelo Bielsa. But in his sense, he's a very defensive manager, But this is a man that very early in his career went all over the world to learn as much as he could about the game in different cultures, in different styles. Very much the same thing going on. Very much understands how everything connects when you talk about patterns and he's, since I got into profiling, I found Roy Hodgson to be very, very interesting, more so than when I just listened to his voice and didn't try to categorize the things that he was saying. You understand what he's actually saying. You think some of this is really fascinating because he's just connecting so many dots between so many things that you wouldn't necessarily put together. So Roy Hodgson's probably not a bad, in terms of personality.
Yeah, and you wouldn't necessarily put them together, but absolutely, yeah. Roy Hodgson's certainly one of the game's thinkers. Finally, then, before we move on, we know all about his tactical acumen. We know about his intensity, the way he has a thirst for knowledge and information. But what is he like on a personal level for the players? Then is he? I mean, I get the feeling he's not necessarily an arm round the shoulder, but is he approachable? Do you think?
I think this might be a case of his age playing to his advantage, in the sense that I think you get beyond a certain age, past 60, and I think you automatically get the respect that you possibly, I think it's harder for younger players to challenge someone that's so much older than them. So I think on that level, there's an admiration there, I think, on behalf of the players. But in terms of the emotional side of the game and how he manages his dressing room, he's been known to say that, the dressing room manages the dressing room. That's not my job. And he literally, we talk about systems thinking and throwing things in to see what emerges and see what happens. When he puts a new player into the dressing room, he's been known to say, I wait to see the behavior of the other players to see whether that player's been accepted by the tribe. So it's very much the player's decision whether another player, a new player, is accepted into the group, because the way the players behave, whether they want the ball off that person or whether they give the ball to that person willingly, he believes that these things have these things kind of emerge as and of themselves. It's not players thinking, oh, I don't want to pass to him. If they're not passing to a certain player, there'll be a reason that they probably don't even understand themselves, but there will be a reason for it. Everything's somehow interconnected, and our behavior is just an emergent of, the conditions, basically. So, he basically, the dressing room will oversee the dressing room and will manage itself. And on a one-to-one level, I think they'll just see him as an intense character who's just obsessive about the actual game and trying to get that information into them.
Yeah, and he's very, very popular with fans as well. Mike, I'm glad you've been complimentary of Marcelo Bielsa, because as someone who lives in Leeds, if you hadn't been, I was fearing for my safety whenever I stepped out the house. There's lots of murals around the city as well, which are very, very impressive as well, with big pictures of him. So I see him on an almost daily basis when I travel around. But he's a hugely popular figure, isn't he, with fans? And he does seem quite modest off the pitch as well.
Yeah, I think it would have been a shame had his career passed without him coming to the Premier League, without him managing a club like Leeds United, and without him being revered as much as he is now while he's still playing, while he's still managing, sorry. It's it would have been a shame. I think there's something a little bit mythical about his past now, that's basically it's gone into folklore, some of the stories about him early in his career, I believe. But I think he's an absolutely fascinating character. And I think it's great that I think it speaks volumes, the fact that someone so old and so late in the career can be now seen as one of the innovators in a game that has changed so much, that is now so much. The younger generation now is moving the game forward. And yet here's this older manager that is right at the forefront of everything that's happening.
Yeah, and absolutely revered in this part of West Yorkshire as well. Hopefully, he can stick around in the English game for a bit longer. Marcelo Bielsa, a real fascinating character. So before we move on to our second manager in profile today, who will be Oxford's Karl Robinson, and we've got lots to say about him as well. Let's just very quickly give a mention to Foxpunter, Mike. How can you sign up?
Just go to foxpunter.com. All the information is now up there about the service. It's being updated all the time, little elements being added of different components of the service. There's short videos and things like that, but it's all at foxpunter.com.
Excellent. And you can follow us on Twitter as well, at Foxpunter. We're on Facebook, and we are also on YouTube as well, where you can watch all of the clips from the earlier podcasts and the podcast as a whole as well. So let's move on to our second manager of the podcast. We're going to talk about Karl Robinson next. So Oxford United have a fair few games to make up, actually, after a few COVID call-offs earlier in the campaign. And this weekend, they lost to Swindon Town. Karl Robinson called out his substitutes. We'll hear what he has to say in a minute, but it's not the first time that he's done something like this. The first one was following a 2-0 home defeat to Crewe. That was a couple of weeks ago. And here he accused his players of letting all of the support staff down.
I asked all my staff to leave and just left me and 3 of the staff to speak to the players, because I feel that the support staff are giving everything they possibly can to give the players what they need, but I don't think it's reciprocated in the reverse of that. And fundamentally, I have to open myself up to the players and go, come on, is it what we're doing? Is it something that we need to change? And nothing came back. So it's not as if, and after a lot of me speaking to them in a very calm way, I think you've seen me a lot angrier and a lot more animated than what I'm probably stood here speaking. But my message to the players was very, very calculated. It was very calm in my approach to it, which arguably is something that, for me, probably comes a little bit more from the heart and a little bit more cutting, rather than the ranter and the raving that sometimes is just white noise. And that certainly wasn't the case.
So Karl Robinson calling his players out there following a 2-0 defeat to Crewe, accusing them of letting the support staff down. Now, that provoked a reaction. They got 2 really good away performances off the back of that, and maybe the ball was rolling at this point. However, Oxford, who were widely expected to be in the top 6 and were tipped by many for promotion this season, were expected to kick on. However, 1-0 up in the big derby against rivals Swindon, who are now managed by John Sheridan, a former subject of this podcast. 85 minutes on the clock. They concede twice in quick succession to throw it away. Who does Karl Robinson blame this time? Only the substitutions that he made.
1-0, half-time. It looks like the perfect end to a perfect week. What happened?
Marcus' groin was stiff. That's why we made that change, which we didn't have to. But I think the substitutions that came on made no impact on the football match. I think we went backwards when we made the subs. And listen, I goes and do is apologise. I can't do any more and come out here and I can't protect my players today. You make changes to make your team better. I think our changes made our team worse. And then the goal at the end is just disgusting.
Disgusting, says Karl Robinson. And one of his subs, Mark Sykes, made the mistake for the first Swindon goal of the game. So, Mike, this is a curious case of a manager calling his players out, which in itself is not unusual. But to call out the substitutes that he made is certainly different, isn't it?
Yeah, there's dynamics going on here because I think with Robinson, I mean, we've just spoken about Marcelo Bielsa. Karl Robinson's got the same flow state, thinks in the same way, but he thinks in that way about emotions and about how players feel or where things are going wrong emotionally within the team. And I just think he's in a similar sense, he's very experimental. And he's trying to find out what's going wrong in these. And I think he uses the media as a means to see, if I push this button, what response does it get? If I push that button, does it get this response? And he's constantly learning about his players by pushing their emotional buttons when things aren't going well. And then, likewise, when things are going well, it's about keeping emotions on an even keel. So if he thinks the players are getting too excited or not getting excited enough, these are the kind of things he picks up on. And these are the cues he's looking for all the time. Now, what's happened is Oxford are in poor form. There's a backstory to it in the fact that they lost in the playoff final last year. So there's a potential hangover there. There's a short turnaround in terms of, how quickly they had to get ready for the new season. There was the expectation of finishing in the top 6. Now, for Robinson, this is all a lot of emotion to carry and a lot of emotion to manage among the players, because some players will thrive in certain situations, others will struggle. And when you're having to turn over players in the summer, you're having to understand new personalities. So, he would have loved, I think, to have just turned up this season, plug and play the standards that Oxford had last season, and I'm sure there would have, no doubts, would have been in the top 6. But because he's a manager that gets all these emotions on an even keel, and then you make changes in the summer, you don't get the same results. You get different emergence from the system, So this is what he's wrestling with at the moment. And it's kind of reached a point where Oxford are in a position now where they were fully expected to be in the top 6 this season, possibly knocking on the door for automatics. We're almost borderline, like, are they going to be in a relegation battle? But either way, in terms of motivation, the top 6 is a long way away at the moment, and you're playing catch up on games. You've had the COVID issues, things like that. There's a lot going on that is, I wouldn't say outside of Robinson's comfort zone, because he's very comfortable doing this kind of thing, but there's a lot for him to contend with at the minute. And it's not about the football. Oxford have a set way of playing that they're very good at, and by most opposition managers' accounts, they're probably the best team in the division on the day at the way they play. The very, very difficult team to deal with. So it's not the football thing that's the problem for Robinson. It's about getting everybody in the right emotional space to perform at the best.
Yeah, because his side made quite a slow start last season as well, before, as you mentioned, eventually finding themselves in the playoffs. Is there, or could there be a reason for these slow starts? And I guess we're all just bracing ourselves for a run post-January, are we?
Possibly, and there could be something in it if we're talking turnover of players. His recruitment's been good down the years, but then, if you're recruiting new players and you don't fully understand the personalities yet of those players and what actually makes them tick, you only know them on a technical level from what you've seen, then that might take a little while to bed those things in, because you're a manager that over time, managers play to their own strengths and what their own mental processes are. Eventually, the team becomes a reflection of those mental processes. So whereas some of these new players have come in now and really don't get this guy, what's he, why is he doing this? Why is he saying this in press conferences and not fully understanding? He's learning about them, but they've also got to learn about him and understand that, no, this is the way you eventually will get the best out of you once he understands who you are and what you respond to. So there's all these little dynamics that have got to play out until the players and the manager are on the same level. But the one thing Robinson is very forgiving. He can say some of the most cutting things in the dressing room, in the media conferences afterwards. I wouldn't say he doesn't mean it. He's saying he's kind of coming from the heart in the moment, but then he can quickly backtrack if he thinks he's made a mistake and said something that was a bit out of turn. But he's not afraid to push those buttons in the first place. And he's looking for a reaction. He wants a reaction because then once he gets a reaction, okay, I can start mapping that behaviour now and making sense of who you are as a person, what actually makes you tick. So I think that's what he's doing. I think a lot of this is probably just a fact-finding mission for him. But he's also in a place now where he's got to be careful. Like we've seen him call out the players for not respecting the amount of work that goes in from the support staff. But having called out the entire team, it's probably wise on his part to then only isolate the substitutes in this example, rather than calling out all of the same players twice. It's also worth pointing out as well, they responded to the Crew defeat with a win away at Wigan, where they were dominant. Wigan, probably the worst team in the division at the moment, but were dominant. Went to Portsmouth, put in a good performance. Robinson was full of praise for the same individuals who he picked out after the Crew game. Jordan Abita being one who's a new signing. Absolutely full of praise. Couldn't single them out enough. Some managers don't want to single out players. He couldn't single them out quick enough and really sort of, wax lyrical about the technical abilities and about their attitude and things like that. So there's to and fro. It's not all one way, but at least I suppose one thing you could say is it's only 3 players being called out this time. So the rest have got off the hook, and that might be a bit less damaging going forward. That, now let's see how these 3 players respond and potentially look for Robinson praising them to the hilt in the coming weeks.
Does he ever take responsibility himself then? Because it's kind of a strange one. He's blaming the subs who he put on the pitch, but does he ever come out, hold his hands up and say, look, that was my fault. I got the tactics wrong. I underestimated the opponents. I was outwitted by the opposition manager. Anything like that? Does he ever, or does he like to sort of deflect the blame?
I wouldn't say he likes to deflect the blame any more than most managers. I don't know. It's one of those. He is a manager that more than most possibly has an excuse lined up, and that might be directed at the referee. And he might just be his emotions spilling out with disappointment at the end of a game because he is an emotional guy. But he can also hold his hands up to mistakes he's made. But those mistakes, then he is the sort of manager that will unpack the mistake, and the mistake has always come from a place where it was his original thinking that didn't quite work out this time. But here's all the other connecting pieces that most of you probably didn't get, that I'll explain it all to you now so you understand my mistake. That's kind of how he works when it comes to mistakes. So he can hold his hands up, but he's a character that in his early days, and I think a lot of people got wound up by Karl Robinson and probably still do, opposition fans. He is one that can wind up opposition fans. But yeah, he can get people's backs up with some of the things he says sometimes, because he can be quite, he talks a good game. Sometimes when that's not meant as a compliment, when people say, oh, he talks a good game, that's kind of Robinson. He's an original thinker. He wants to, in his press conferences, he wants to say the original thing all the time. And it's, for me, I find it very engaging. I find it very interesting because you find out things about the game that from other managers just not coming forward and giving you this kind of insight. So even though you have to sometimes take some of the things he says with a pinch of salt, you get a lot of insight from him. So I do like him for that, and I've grown to like him more and more over the years.
I'm not expecting you to maybe know this, but is any of that born out of the fact that he didn't play the professional game like many of his contemporaries in League One and certainly the rest of the EFL? So is he kind of always having to, step it up a level in post-match and pre-match to kind of prove himself, or is that bobbins?
I wouldn't say there's any real insecurity around that. There might have been in his early days, but I think now he's been around the block and certainly at League One level for long enough to understand that he knows the game as well as anyone at this level, and understands what goes into setting a team up on a Saturday, preparing a team for a match, and the standards at the level. So that might have been the case earlier in his career, but I don't think it is now. I think there's no insecurity at all. I just think he very much wears his heart on his sleeve, and sometimes it is to his detriment, and sometimes it can feed into the players. death or glory scenarios, for example, I would imagine, I guess you could say the weekend's a prime example, the derby game, where there's so much at stake emotionally, then that's when I do worry about a Karl Robinson team, because, everything's so intrinsically linked to those emotions and what's going on inside that, his teams are very exciting and, basically one of the most creative and attacking teams in the division, but it's all process-based. And when results mean the most, sometimes you have to go beyond the process, and win at all costs mentality has to come to the fore, which is something that he has improved on in recent seasons. He has developed a capacity to, away from home, for example, kill games at 1-0 and make sure that hardly any football gets played with time wasting and all these, dark arts. He's embraced that side of things more, but I think ultimately you can't separate him from his emotions within a match, and sometimes that's not always to the benefit of the team.
Who else then might we compare Karl Robinson to, whether that be another manager in the same division or someone else across the EFL, or perhaps even further afield?
Quite a few. But Brian Clough, interestingly, is I make a very similar personality type, probably the same personality type. Clough, of course, was a very original thinker, but he was all about the emotions of his players as well. It was about chasing a feeling of the way the game should be played. It was about, you hear about his charismatic team talks and the things that he went into. I always think of Sean Dyche saying about Clough coming into the dressing room on his hands and knees, like taking sort of 5 minutes to get to the centre of the dressing room and placing the ball down on top of a towel and then walking out as though like this is the most precious thing in the world. And it was a form of like artistic expression that was like words weren't enough to express how much you should love and care for that football. Very much from a place of, internal emotion of this, of backing up his philosophy and the way he wanted to play. So yeah, I mean, you can compare him to Clough, and there's plenty of managers that way. It just kind of all the different elements show up in different ways for different managers, even when they're the same type. But for him, it's about recognizing the patterns of behaviour and mapping it to emotions.
So what's the best way forward then for Oxford and Karl Robinson? If he takes time to get to know, the personalities of his players and work them out, is it best that they have a quiet January transfer window, do you think, in which maybe just one or two recruits strengthening areas that perhaps injuries have hit hard? Or are we likely to see a few more, a bit more of an overhaul in January? Because if he's still finding out about his players, he doesn't want to be in this position in March, does he?
No, and yeah, this is it. I think this is the concern, is that when you're calling out players regularly, and if if he gets to a point now between now and January, he's saying, right, some of these players will never play for this club again, he doesn't necessarily mean it. Whereas if some other manager said that, that would be the end of it. Whereas for him, he's quite forgiving and he doesn't necessarily mean it. But you reach a point where you've exhausted all these avenues of trying to get a tune out of your players, where you're left with no choice but to start again and freshen it up again. And then you've got these new personalities to get used to. I think time is the great healer for Oxford here. It's just a shame for them that I think it's probably too late now this season for them to get into you never say never, but it's a tall order now for them to get into that top six, given how comfortable some of the big hitters are already. So, I think just time's the healer for them. I just think he'll get used to these dynamics soon enough, and they'll probably turn a corner as and when he gets the reactions he wants. It did look as though the last two performances were a reaction to the Crewe game. I guess they can just they will try to wipe this off as a blip. The three substitutes were the problem. It was only 15 minutes in what is now 3 games of good performances, and they'll try to isolate it as much as they can and move on, I think.
Yeah, well, we'll keep our eye on Oxford, and certainly for that second half of the season run, which happened 12 months ago. We'll see if Karl Robinson can pull the same rabbit out of the hat once again. Right, before we go, Mike, let's tackle any other business. And I believe you're heading to the Championship for this. Yeah,
I think it was a big win for Neil Harris this weekend. I mean, he came out himself on his Thursday press conference ahead of the weekend, and said, I'm fighting for my life. And I don't think there was any two ways about it. And Cardiff have been in this position this season where, because they've had so many draws, it was teetering on the brink of, it was neither one thing nor the other. So then suddenly you suffer 2 or 3 defeats in the space of 4 or 5 games, and you're in crisis mode all of a sudden. And I've said this in recent episodes. It's amazing now how quickly, especially in lockdown, I believe, how quickly the questions come about fearing for your position. What does this mean for you, this result? And, and it's because the noise on social media is even greater, and the noises of discontent are even louder. Whereas I think it's harder for reporters to go at a manager with those kinds of questions when a team haven't been booed off. There's still the same noise on social media, but if a team haven't been booed off and they're not shouting Harris out from the stands, then, reporters are more conscious not to go in with those types of questions. But now all you get on social media is Harris out. So that's kind of where they're taking their questions. So he's kind of reached this point all of a sudden where he had Luton at home, Huddersfield at home, and you're thinking 4 points at least you need from these 2 games. And I think he kind of spelled out himself that, and he's not out of the woods yet. It's only 1 win, but an emphatic win, 4-0 against Luton. But he kind of doubled down on he doubled down on how much his players were behind him. How much did he care about the club? How much did he care about the shirt? How much did he care about me and my position, or, their own reputations? And when the players probably needed tactical answers, anyway, they've answered his question. So now, it's kind of a reset, I suppose. But they need to keep picking up results. He's not out of the woods yet. But when he needed the answer most from his players, that they were fully behind him, he got it.
Absolutely. And if you do want to find out more about Neil Harris, a very tribal manager, as we discussed a few episodes ago, you can go back, check out our feed on Spotify or iTunes, and find the episode in which we spoke about Neil Harris at length. But keep an eye on Cardiff over the next few weeks and see if that was a one-off or whether the players play for Harris once more. Right, Mike, as ever, thank you very much for joining us. A fascinating insight into Marcelo Bielsa and Karl Robinson.
Yeah, cheers, Jack. Thanks a lot.
And we'll do it all again in 7 days' time. Do hope you can join us then for another edition of Foxpunter Manager Profiling.